Welcome back, everyone, to the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast. I'm your host, Wedge. Today's episode will be the 10-minute report Falcons. Before we jump into today's video, please make sure you guys go follow me on Instagram at Wedge52Gridiron, as well as right here on Spotify. And also check out the other episodes. I've released several 10-minute reports already, and will continue to release a 10-minute report every day the month of July. With that being said, let's jump into today's 10-minute report on the Atlanta Falcons. Starting off with the signal caller, the question mark at the quarterback position that the Atlanta Falcons find themselves in coming up to this 2023 season. While they have two decent options, it will definitely be interesting to see which one gets the initial start. And then if that selected quarterback is able to withhold the position throughout the season based on their performance, obviously, and how the team is functioning and performing, really, with them at quarterback. So the two options, it's going to come down to Desmond Ridder, who, was a rookie last year. In his 4 games that he started, he went 2-2 record with about 700 yards, 2 touchdowns, and no interceptions. So decent numbers for a rookie quarterback. A little light on the touchdowns and yards, but Falcons did not really have, the craziest of weapons. They had Drake London, who had a solid rookie performance, and then Kyle Pitts was in his second year. Had a little bit of a down year, as well as was dealing with an injury. So it's going to be Desmond Ridder or Taylor Heineke, who they brought in over free agency. They brought him in on a 2-year, $14 million deal from Washington, is where he was previously. In his couple years with Washington, he threw for 5,400 yards, 33 touchdowns, and 21 interceptions. And he was good enough for a just about 500 record, going 12, 11, and 1 tie. And of course, the Heineke special, I believe, beating Tampa Bay, I believe that in the playoffs. So that was a shocker. That was a cool one, with him diving towards the pylon for that. So Taylor Heineke, I believe he was getting paid like it was like his last contract was like 1 year, $3 or $4 million, I want to say, and now he's making $7 million a year. So he definitely, has shown some flashes in Washington. So I think a solid option for the Falcons to, they're going to have a quarterback battle, I guess, during training camp, and preseason is probably going to have a bigger impact on, who the Falcons' starting quarterback is come week 1 than some other teams' quarterback competitions. Moving into some free agent signings, the Falcons were very active in free agency during this offseason, in part because of their poor record last year. They obviously needed, they're in a rebuild. They needed an overhaul, as well as they had the second most cap space entering the 2023 offseason here. And they definitely spent some of it. So I'm going to run through quite a few of the signings real quick. They signed safety Jesse Bates, who was previously with Cincinnati. In 5 seasons in Cincinnati, Bates had 479 tackles, 43 pass deflections, and 14 interceptions, which those are all pretty good numbers for a safety. Of course, 480 tackles, that's almost 100 tackles a season as a safety is definitely good numbers. He's going to get you a handful of interceptions and a decent amount of pass breakups. So Jesse Bates will help kind of, help boost their secondary, who's already pretty solid with starting cornerback A.J. Terrell. He's obviously had a couple really good seasons during his career, as well as they just traded the Lions for Jeff Okudah as well during this offseason. And they're hoping that he kind of bounces back. He had some struggles towards the end of his Detroit career in terms of, getting flags, I believe. based on my memory. But they're hoping those three starting DBs out of their four should hopefully provide them a pretty solid secondary. They also re-signed offensive tackle Caleb McGarry, who was a free agent. He has 62 starts for them in the previous 4 years. He's been very solid at tackle for them. Definitely a key piece of their offensive line. And I think it was a good move for the Falcons to definitely re-sign him. If they're going to be having quarterback problems, it's definitely, I think, important to at least retain offensive linemen that are solid enough, have started a lot of games for you. So that'll help out Ritter as well if it is, him starting behind McGarry, a little bit of familiarity with one of his tackles. And then they signed linebacker Lorenzo Carter, re-signed him as well. He had 58 tackles, 4 sacks, and 6 tackles for a loss last season. Pretty good numbers for a linebacker. Pretty decent, I guess. Tackles are a little low in terms of, the elite linebackers we see. But, 4 sacks, 6 tackles for a loss. He's definitely finding the ball. He's getting to the quarterback a couple times this season. Good re-signing there. And then they signed Bud Dupree, who's an edge rusher, most recently in Tennessee with the Titans. He's kind of had a couple down years. I believe he's missed quite a few games the past 2 or 3 seasons. But last year, I believe he had 4 sacks and 6 tackles for a loss, along with 2 fumble recoveries. So obviously not the worst numbers, but nothing spectacular. And then to continue on with defensive signings, they signed Calais Campbell, who is obviously with my Baltimore Ravens recently. And last year he had 36 tackles, 5.5 sacks, and 4 tackles for a loss, as well as 2 forced fumbles. So Calais Campbell, obviously getting towards the end of his career. There was a little bit of speculation about if he would potentially retire after last season. But he's obviously had a remarkable career. Most likely will get into the Hall of Fame, I would say. But definitely a good pickup by the Falcons there. Because even if he doesn't, put up the same numbers he did last season for Baltimore, no matter what, having a guy like that, a veteran who's been at the top of his game, at the top of his game, at the top of the game for his position. There we go. For several years is, it's going to be a mentor to the rest of their team, the rest of that defense. And then sticking with the defensive line, they signed former Chicago Bear Eddie Goldman, who last year, it was a down year for Mr. Goldman, but he still managed 22 tackles, half a sack, and 1 tackle for a loss as an interior defensive lineman. And then moving on to the offensive side for some free agents that they signed. Obviously, they signed quarterback Taylor Heinicke, but then they signed wide receiver Mac Hollins, who was most recently a Las Vegas Raider. Last season, Hollins had 690 yards and 4 touchdowns. And then they signed wide receiver Scotty Miller, who was with Tampa Bay last year. So those 2 wide receiver additions were, while obviously not the best, definitely not elite wide receivers, they're still guys that have shown flashes. Scotty Miller had a couple big plays, I believe 2 or 3 years ago. It was on their Super Bowl run. He had a couple incredible deep pass catches for touchdowns in the playoffs. But their wide receiver room consists of Mac Hollins, Scotty Miller, Slade Bolden, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, and then Drake London, who was a rookie last year, who actually was pretty solid for a rookie wide receiver, posting 866 yards and 4 touchdowns. So the wide receiver room could potentially be the weakest for the Falcons. And then, of course, in the backfield, they drafted Texas running back Bijan Robinson, who is an absolute stud. hopefully for the Falcons and really just for that whole division's sake, to get people to tune into some more of those games. Turns out well, just like he was at Texas. In 3 years, he had 3,400 yards and 33 touchdowns on the ground, as well as 800 yards and 8 touchdowns receiving. So he should also help out their receiving attack since their wide receiver room is, subpar. And then the Falcons' offensive line is actually one of the better offensive lines in football, probably top 10, definitely top 5 in rushing. And I believe they were 3rd in rushing yards last season, as well as they're in the top half of passing in terms of pass protection, probably not passing yards. And that offensive line consists of Chris Lindstrom, Jake Matthews. They drafted Matthew Bergeron, 2nd round, and then obviously re-signed Caleb McGarry, like I said. So we are just over our 10-minute mark. And with that, it leaves me with just the one last thing remaining, and that is my record prediction for the 2023 Atlanta Falcons. I predict that they will go 8-9. That's all I have for the 10-minute report. Falcons, thank you all for listening. Please make sure to check out my other podcast episodes, as well as follow here on Spotify and Instagram at Wedge52Gridiron. Go Ravens.